Hello YouTube, my name is Zach, and today I'm going to be analyzing Rob Halford of Judas Priest. This is Dreamer, Deceiver, and Deceiver from their BBC performance in 1975. This is actually happening as a result of Virtuoso80, one of my patron supporters who requested this video. Thank you, Virtuoso. And if you would like to also request a video, please sign up and subscribe on my Patreon, and you will, if you sign up at the $10 level, you will qualify to be able to request one video that I analyze. I promise that this video will be shorter than my others. I'll edit it more heavily and I won't ramble as much. I know that my last videos have been kind of long, lots of prefacing, stuff like that. Not happening here. I'm going to jump right into it. If you've never seen any of my videos before, this is an objective analysis. I am looking at this as if Rob Halford came into my voice studio and wanted to take voice lessons from me. I am a professional voice teacher. Most of my ideas are based upon health principles, vocal health, and long-term sustainability, not upon whether I like his sound or not. So go into the analysis with that in mind. So without further ado, here we go. Here's Dreamer, Deceiver, and Deceiver. So this entire phrase, I can immediately tell you that it's very much in head voice. You can hear at the beginning of it, it kind of has a little bit more voice on it. The feedback from the microphone kind of makes it difficult to distinguish at the beginning, or it might have been from an amp or something. But either way, the feedback makes it kind of hard to distinguish. But once the phrase develops in the last half of it, he's clearly moved fully into his head voice / falsetto sound. And that's especially evident when you compare what happens later in the video with some of the more full sounds that he creates. But this is definitely a falsetto sound, not a chest voice sound. You can tell by that really airy, wispy kind of quality. And there are going to be times in the future of the video where he actually uses reinforced falsetto. I'll talk about that a little bit when he gets there, but for now, just know that this is, full falsetto. So this is something that is kind of hard to tell. You may have to go back and rewind a little bit to see it. But if you pay attention to this part of his torso, it's actually kind of good that he's got this on where you can actually see his body, because it gives a very good visual demonstration of breathing, and he actually has very good breathing technique. I'm going to actually play this back, and I want you to take a look at how the upper part of his abdomen expands when he breathes before each phrase. So let me play it back for you and pay attention to that. I'll try to point it out. I know we went a little further ahead, but if you notice when I kind of circled with the cursor, you can see that upper part of the abdomen expands outward. That means that his diaphragm is lowering when he's breathing. It's a sign of good breath support. One of the things that you can tell that shows that someone doesn't have good breath support is if they raise their shoulders when they breathe, like they do that kind of thing, as opposed to things expanding outward and down low. So that's a sign of him having good breath support. That's a very solid fundamental thing. And if you have any questions or kind of don't understand how the whole breathing thing works, I do have a video about breathing in the diaphragm. It's actually my least watched video out of all of them that I've made for some reason. I don't know why, but I feel like in some ways it's probably the most essentially informative fundamentally to singing technique. Anyway, so if you want a better idea of how that whole process works, check out my breathing and diaphragm video. It's one of the very first ones ever made. Bad quality, a lot of things that have improved upon now, but still check it out because it does really do, I think, a pretty decent job of going in depth and sort of explains how the whole mechanism works. But yeah, so if you're ever questioning yourself as to whether or not your breathing is good, check your stomach. If your stomach is expanding downward when you breathe, then that means you are breathing diaphragmatically. And if you feel your shoulders raising up when you breathe, you're doing what's called top-heavy breathing, which is where you're basically not allowing your lungs to expand downward and fill up with air. When the diaphragm moves down, it gives the lungs more space to move downward as well and fill up with air when you breathe in. So that's why diaphragmatic breathing is so important. All that said, very good breathing technique so far on him. I see really nice stuff in that regard. So at the beginning of when he said asked, that was a hard glottal onset. And those of you who've watched my videos before know what I mean. For those of you who have not seen my videos before, the hard glottal is when you have too much pressure underneath the folds when you engage words that begin with vowels. So you hear this, he said, asked us. You kind of heard this like rough kind of pop sound. That's an example of a hard glottal onset. That means that his folds basically smack together when he made sound. And once or twice isn't going to kill you, but doing that over and over and over again will eventually cause vocal nodules. So that's one thing from a health perspective that could be he could potentially clean up.
We said we didn't know. Took us by the hand and up we go.
So when he actually sung the word "and" there, he actually placed the N vowel very much into the nose. And so this is kind of a stylistic thing. I've discussed this in prior videos, but using nasal resonance isn't necessarily a bad thing as far as being destructive to the voice, but it does kind of disrupt sort of the coordination that the voice would have naturally. What he did on the word "and" is he went and sort of pushed it way up into the nose. So what that does is it denies the voice the ability to sing on a vowel. So if you sing the word "and," right, it should, theoretically, if you follow like bel canto principles and things like that, the emphasis should be on the sound of "ah" and not the sound of "and." It's the same reason that when you say the word "and," you don't go "and," you don't say it that way, you say "and." So him doing that is just, it's not destructive, it just kind of takes away from his voice's ability to sing on a vowel where it's more naturally resonant and clear, and it's just a little unrefined. I mean, it's not terrible, and it's me being nitpicky, but it's not the end of the world. When I do have voice students, 100% of the time, if they bring this to me, like where they do that, where they go "and," or do anything where they jump onto that consonant too soon, I tell them, hey, let's sing on the vowel because, you know, we speak on vowels, and vowels make more resonant sounds than hard consonants that you lean on do. So most of the time it just sounds better. I know that's super subjective, and I try not to branch into subjective territory on here, but if you take someone singing something with open vowels and then you take someone that sings with a bunch of like closed consonants and you compare the two, there's just a certain quality that's created from singing on the vowels that's just better. So I typically don't say something that's subjective, but I would like to kind of do the Pepsi challenge for you guys one day, and so you can see exactly what I mean. I can give you a clear example of it.
We followed the dreamer.
So really nice in his transition down from the low up to the higher register. You could hear a real consistency between his vocal approach down to the bottom. While he's singing lower notes, you didn't hear the implication that there was some drastic way that he changed his approach to vocalization when he went from the lower register or the lower range into the sort of like mid to higher range. So that's a sign of great vocal coordination. One of the hallmark things of a really refined and healthy singer is that they can carry the same type of vocal consistency all across the range. So if you ever get someone to do a siren and they make the siren sound, oh, or something like that, and there's this huge difference in the way that it sounds from the bottom end to the top end tonally, and in terms of the amount of air coming through and things like that at different points of the range. Typically that's a sign that the singer isn't well coordinated at various parts of the range. When I give voice lessons, I kind of take the approach of coordinating the mid voice as well as you can and then creeping it up and creeping it down. I don't try to like push people into like extremes of their ranges, because that tends to create really imbalanced sounds from the top end to the bottom end. Like one part of the voice might have too much air and the other part has too much pressure. So, you know, it's just one of those things where when you hear someone that evenly and consistently carries the sound all across the range, it's really nice, and it's a sign of just really well coordinated, healthy singing. So far I'm really impressed by his coordination, his breath support, all very good.
Through the purple, hazy clouds.
Another thing that you're not really hearing much of it, he's singing with like a lighter sound. He's not singing with a lot of force and a lot of like aggression, but he's not being super airy and covering the sound up either. That's very common for a lot of rock singers that I found, that when they want to be softer, they just pull all the voice off and they do that, and that's destructive, as I've described many times in the past. He's doing a very nice job of keeping it even and on the voice, so good stuff there too. Control. So yeah, there we go. If you listen to the O, he turned it into kind of an ooh. So if you've been watching my more recent videos, you see that as you move up the voice, it kind of makes sense to close your vowels up. So he closed that O up into an ooh. That's a perfect vowel modification. Nice stuff, good sound. I really like it. He's showing some pretty solid vocal chops here. This is good.
We thought we were lost, but
So this is a great video for a lot of reasons. First off, I get really good views of him, and so I can see his embouchures, I can see his tension, and so it's a really good way for me to be able to give you some really in-depth details about some things. So if you notice at the beginning of that phrase, you saw just a little tiny bit of forehead tension pop up, but it went away. And I'm going to address the tension thing a little bit more later in this video, because it's a subject that I've been wanting to talk about for a while. But as a general rule, so far with the singing, I'm not seeing a lot of tension at all. He's singing pretty effortlessly and freely without tensing up. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later once he gets to the more aggressive stuff. And you'll kind of see where I'm coming from with some of these things. But so far, he's done a really good job of not having a lot of tension. It's really good.
no matter how we try.
So I know I'm stopping this a lot, but the timbre of his voice implies that right now he's not singing with a low larynx. He's singing with a neutral to high larynx. And I know I've talked a lot about singing with a low larynx in these videos. If you're singing at like a mezzo forte or mezzo piano, like middle kind of dynamic level, singing with a high larynx is not the end of the world. It's not until you start getting into the extremes of the range where you really need to start changing the amount of space you have in your vocal tract, because the less space you have when it gets higher or lower, the more work you have to do. And you don't want that work to be on your vocal folds. You'd rather that work be distributed across the whole tract. So for now, he's using a high larynx. You can kind of tell because the sound has this kind of really sort of edge. It's not super loud, it's not super big, but one of the words that you can use to define it is like bite. It has this bite on the sound that it doesn't sound open, it doesn't sound closed, but it just doesn't have that really like wide open vibrato-y like robust sound. It sounds sort of thin, and that's a sign that he's using the higher larynx position. But like I said, at this range of the voice, it's not a big deal. It's really not a problem at all.
Is a single sonic sound that is vibrating constantly.
So that particular phrase was a little heavy on the nasal resonance, and like I've said before, that's kind of more of a stylistic or preference thing. I don't like the nasal resonance because it's typically indicative of extra push and pressure from underneath, and it's virtually impossible to sing with a low larynx when you have nasal resonance. So if you're moving up in the voice and you're closing things up and you're sticking it to your nose, typically that's a sign that you're probably pushing too hard or working too hard. I mean, he's not showing signs of strain or stress here, so that may not be the case in this particular example, but they tend to correlate and lend to one another. So that's why typically people keep people away from the nasal thing. A lot of pop singers use the nasal stuff super exclusively. It kind of creates a resonance that cuts through really well. One of the biggest kind of critics I hear from people who aren't educated on the voice, when they like listen to singers, they'll say, oh, well, that person sounds like they're singing nasally. You know, someone who's not really trained on critical listening with the voice, that they'll use that critique because it's one of those very polarizing sounds. You either like it or you don't. For me, I don't really like the sound, but that's just my opinion. Objectively speaking, it's not a terrible sound to make in terms of being like physically destructive. It just sort of gums things up in terms of the interactions between the folds, the soft palate, the larynx, and the resonators and articulators in the mouth. It just sort of obscures everything a little bit. So I like to kind of stray away from that, because there's always a way to make the sound without having to put the resonance in your nose. You got tons of resonators all throughout your mouth, and you got tons of ways to make space to allow sound to reverberate and whatnot. So you don't have to push it into the nose. So that's kind of my view on it. It's not going to kill you, but it's just not the way that I like to approach singing, or teaching voice for that matter.
And if we could grab and hold on to the nose.
So yeah, here he's getting a little bit tight. You can see that stuff kind of welling up right here. Things are tightening up just a little bit. And like I said, I'm going to go into that a little bit more a little bit later, but just so that you can kind of see it and be mindful of it. That's the sign that the face is really tightening up. It kind of is locking up his embouchures a little bit. Generally, his embouchures or his lip shaping is very good. He's not going out way too wide on things. He's keeping it pretty vertical. That's, of course, very good. But the facial tension can be even restrictive on your embouchures, even if you're keeping them more closed, because all these muscles tighten up and it makes everything less flexible. So, again, the biggest thing I'm seeing here is just the extraneous tension. Other than that, I'm not really seeing anything that is vocally destructive. The sounds that he's creating seem to be well within the framework of healthy singing so far.
Oh, they're free.
Okay, so I know the question's coming. What was that? That was reinforced falsetto. Now, I'm going to explain what I mean by this so that you all can kind of get a very clear idea where I'm coming from. Now, I'm not a scientist. I don't study acoustics. I don't deal with that kind of thing. So if I say something that's slightly inaccurate, I apologize up front. But the best way to describe what's happening is the surface area of the folds is getting smaller because there is a tiny separation at the top end of the folds. That tiny separation is what creates the sound of falsetto. And since the surface area of the folds is smaller, they're pulled just as tightly as they would be otherwise. The vibrations are happening at the rate that they would naturally, but the smaller surface area allows for higher pitches to be sung than they would be if the entire surface area of the folds are connected. So that's what creates the falsetto sound. So there are two ways that you can go about using the falsetto sound once that separation in the folds is created. You can either use the same kind of pressure that you would use in your modal register, your chest voice, and it gives that reinforced sound like what he created. Or you can just kind of let the sound come out with that separation being there without putting extra pressure under the folds. And then you get that airy, headier, wispier sounding head voice. So what he's doing here is he's engaging his folds and allowing the pressure to be used underneath the folds the same way as if he were singing normally, but that separation at the top end of the folds allows it to have that falsetto sound. One of the big questions I get is for these really high tenors that sing these super high pitches, this stuff that's like way in the stratosphere with the reinforced falsetto, is it healthy? The answer to that question is it depends. If you choose to utilize the modal approach to the falsetto to create this reinforced falsetto sound like he is, the same general vocal health principles apply as to when you're singing in your modal register. You don't want to push. You want to have space in the throat. You want to have a raised soft palate so that you've got plenty of room for the sound to move. You do not want to raise your larynx up and just force the sound out, because then you're effectively doing the same thing as if you were singing in your chest voice in an unhealthy raised larynx fashion. It's just the same thing, except you have an extra separation in the folds that's allowing you to sing higher. Now, if you're not using that extra sound, the reinforced sound, some of those things don't apply. You can use the higher larynx type stuff and it's okay. The difference in sound would be, this is the non-reinforced. It would sound like, ah, something like that, sort of lighter, airier sounding. And if I used a reinforced sound, it would be like this. Ah. You can kind of hear the difference between the two. But when I did the second one, I actually raised my soft palate. I gave myself a little bit more space to operate because I don't want to make my voice push in the same way that it would if I were trying to sing that note in my regular modal register. So that kind of gives you a general idea in the differences in sounds. Head voice without the reinforced and the reinforced sound. And now you can kind of understand what the differences between them are. So hopefully that clears that up, because that's a question that I've gotten a ton since I started this channel. And I'm glad that I finally got a good opportunity to sort of settle things up there. It's hard to tell because I can't really see, but it sounds like he's using the reinforced falsetto with the high larynx. Now, I might be wrong on this, but the reason that I say that it sounds like it has a high larynx is that typically when you raise the soft palate and you lower the larynx with the falsetto, it has almost more of a soprano type sound to it. Like if you ever want to hear an example of it, you can look up Chanticleer. They're a all male choir, and they have some countertenors who actually sing soprano parts. But they did a piece by Ravel that kind of was a really good demonstration of the men singing the soprano part in that reinforced falsetto, but they used the raised soft palate, so you can sort of hear the difference in the sound. It sounds more soprano-like when you have the lowered larynx raised soft palate. So here it doesn't sound like he's doing that. Like I said, I might be wrong, but just based on like the ear test, it doesn't sound like he is. And I'll put a link in the description so that you all can sort of see the difference of what I'm talking about when I say that.
You can find a way. You can surely try.
So one thing that's really good about what he did is that he actually made the transition from his modal register into that head voice so smooth that you can't even tell if he's using a mixed voice or not. So what that's really indicative of is that he has a very good control of that space in between the head voice and the chest voice, the vocal mix. He has a really well-developed vocal mix to the point to where he can use that as a tool to navigate from his lower range up into his high range, and that's ultimately the goal. The best way I've found to develop that is just to do sirens from the low up to the high act, and if there's any break in the sound, you go back and slide more slowly, and you want to make sure that that sound connects all the way through. So it'd be something similar to like if I go, oh, and I'm not going to go up as high as I could, but the idea is that transition between voices is very smooth. So that's kind of what he's doing here. And you can clearly tell that he's worked on the process of developing that in between so that he can make it just as full across the voice. And that way, when he's in that full reinforced falsetto sound, it's not that different from his, modal register. Again, this goes back to one of the very first comments I made in this video, is that his vocal consistency across the voice is very, very good. He's got a great even tone all the way across, and that's a sign of someone who spent a lot of time coordinating their voice all the way across the range.
Solar wind is blowing.
That whole thing, I've got a couple things to say about it. I like the roundness in his O vowel. The fact that his embouchure was really rounded on the O, that's really good. When you see a nice circular motion with the lips on the O vowel, typically that means it's very vertical and well aligned. So that was very good. The problem is his vibrato, and the vibrato was not natural. And if you watch my Bruce Dickinson video, I kind of went into this a little bit. I don't necessarily think that he was physically manufacturing it in the way that Bruce Dickinson did, whereas Bruce Dickinson did that like moving his jaw thing to make the vibrato happen. I've encountered a few singers who approach vibrato this way, and in my experience, I've found that what they're doing is they're pushing, and that push makes the voice kind of wobble. So if they go, like that, that's kind of what they're doing to make that vibrato sound. And the way that you can tell is that the actual waveform or the pitch variation is really uneven and inconsistent. Typically, someone with a natural vibrato, it kind of has this spin sort of sound, and you can almost determine like a rhythm of the path of the vibrato. So if like, for example, if I go, ah, you can hear the vibrato kind of go da 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 da, and there's this sort of even, consistent sort of rhythm between the pulses of the vibrato. In his, it kind of was like it kind of just moved with an uneven sort of frequency. And typically, when you hear that uneven frequency of vibrato, that means that it's not natural and it's being manufactured in some way. So if I put together the experience that I have with singers that make vibrato like this, it's probably as a result of a lot of push, and it kind of reinforces the sound that he's creating. This particular portion where he's singing, it sounds more forced and pushed than what he was doing before. So all that kind of lines up that maybe he's got the feeling that he needs to sing more aggressively and push a little harder since he's singing, more aggressive part of the song. And so if he is actually using that kind of push, then he actually is doing something physically destructive to his voice. Now, I don't know how he sustained his career. I don't know much about him at all beyond just this video and the little bits of Judas Priest that I've heard. But I, if he's been consistent throughout his career, then maybe it's something that he's learned to manage. But for the vast majority of people that use this sort of method of creating vibrato, it puts way too much force and strain on the folds themselves. So as a general rule, if you're going to work toward creating vibrato, you want to aim for something that's more natural and more even. Some people don't even like using vibrato when they sing, and that's fine too. But usually vibrato is a byproduct of full chord closure, and there's an oscillation that happens on the folds that makes it happen. So in this case, it's definitely not the full closure and oscillation. Or as I said, the rhythm of the vibrato would be a little more even. Yeah, here you can really see that tension. You can even hear the vowel, that E. He really tightened up the E a lot. When you hear that bright of an E vowel, it's usually that they push the tongue up really far in their mouth and they tighten up their forehead. E, E. That's kind of the muscular affect that happens when you make that sort of sound of a vowel. So here there's a whole lot of tension. This gives me a moment. I want to address a question that it's actually a semi-discussion I had with someone who commented. They said that, well, I think that it was actually in response to the Devin Townsend video I made, where they said, well, how do we know that, the tension isn't part of the performance? And so that is a very, very fair argument to make. There are a couple of things that I like to say in response to that so that all of you can kind of understand where I'm coming from with this. Tension affects the way that the mechanism works, whether it's intentional or not. And tension, in many cases, ultimately proves physically destructive to the mechanism in the long term. And that goes strictly from a health perspective, not from the way that you're creating sound or what the sound sounds like, strictly from health. If you over tense everything, the structure is more likely to break down in the future because the muscles are being worked more than they would if you weren't using the tension. So one of the arguments that was made was, well, if they're singing with tension, what if they just want the audience to see them a certain way? Or what if they're trying to make it part of the show? And if you're in a very intimate setting where, you're playing in front of a small crowd and people can see your face very clearly, yes, I could see your facial expressions being relevant. But if you're singing in front of a concert hall of 10,000, 20,000 people, and you're down at the bottom of the stage or, in this huge area, they probably aren't going to be able to see your face. So that probably won't have as much of a bearing on the way that people interpret your performance as you might think. So I think that most of the time when people sing with tension, it's something that's habitual. It's not something that's done on purpose. And that comes from my teaching experience and running into other singers who do it, to myself having tension when I sing. And ultimately this whole obsession I have with tension comes from a workshop that I did with a Met singer named Jeffrey Wells. And in that lecture and in that workshop, he actually took some of the greatest opera singers of all time, some of the most well-known Met singers, and showed how they have the same problem, and that part of the process of being a truly free and easy and open singer is letting all that tension go and not having to work around it and work in spite of it. So even at the objectively most difficult levels of singing, like opera is, the most athletic forms of singing that exist, people still deal with tension. So it's something that every singer should strive to free themselves of, because you really don't need facial tension to sing. If you can make a sound, you can do it without clenching your face up. You don't have to do that. I would definitely say that in terms of strict technique and health, the heavier stuff is less technically sound and less healthy than his early singing. And I've mentioned this before at several different points. And this actually brings up another really good point, because I got asked by another comment. Someone said something like, I was being redundant with some of the commentary that I had. And it partly comes with the territory. I've mostly just been analyzing rock singers, metal singers, that kind of thing. And I've found through doing this so far that rock and metal singers typically tend to have similar vocal habits, that they're very tense. They push too hard, that kind of, lot of high larynx singing, that kind of thing. If I moved into pop or country or jazz or R&B or whatever, they'd all have their own little tropes and things that they do as a byproduct of the style as well. So I say all that to say that it seems like he's pushing harder here because the music demands the more aggressive sound because it's heavier than it was before. Now, I want you all to understand that I'm not saying that you should never make these kinds of sounds. You should never push. You should never use tension ever. I like for people to be able to make educated and informed decisions. If you want to sing with tension to express yourself in a certain way at a certain point in a song, that's great. I think that it's totally fine. It's just like if you want to make a glottal onset or you want to make a covered sound, anything like that. That's fine as long as you do it in moderation and you know that you're consciously doing it. I'm fine with it. That's kind of where my whole philosophy and all this comes from. So I'm not just saying that he's using tension and bad technique because he can't sing. It's not that at all. I think he's a very good singer, and he's clearly got excellent control, and he's got a great range. So there are a lot of really good things going on with his voice here. So my comments and my critiques are more in the intention of allowing you to make better choices ultimately.
We shall stay forever.
So yeah, that even just jumping up to that high pitch with that reinforced falsetto, he didn't show a lot of tension there, so that was good that he didn't push that hard. He's got an almost inordinately great control between his modal and that top end of his head voice. It's really good, and that's something that he's clearly nurtured a lot. I don't know how old he was here, but like that's a sign of some really solid chops with the modal to head voice coordination, and that's something that people spend their entire lives working to master. I mean, look at guys like Matt Bellamy or Tom York. I mean, that's kind of like their shtick, is doing that. And they spent their whole lives trying to, learn to do that better and coordinate that. So he's done a very good job working on coordinating that. There are some students that I've had that have spent a year or more trying to coordinate just the head voice transitions, and they can't do it very well. Navigating that passaggio, they can't do it very well. So he's done a really good job of making that tone even all the way up and down the range. That's really nice stuff.
If you wanna find us in
Oh, wow. So, yeah. So that is... I've never sung in that kind of range, so I'm not even sure what he's doing to make that sound happen. It sounds like he opened up in the back and he put the resonance right up at the top of his mouth, because I heard this like overtonish sort of bright sound that happened along with the E. I'm just going by what I hear though, so I don't know physically what he did to make that happen, but in terms of the way that he's positioning his resonators, that's what it sounds like. His embouchure's pretty closed, and he didn't go way out wide, so it's got to be something that he's doing in a more vertical fashion. So I would imagine that as a result, the soft palate is raising. He's probably having to lower the larynx. I mean, that's great. That's all very good. I mean, he's got a lot of tension in his face, but the way that he created the sound has got to be at least within the framework of like good, healthy, open singing. It's hard to tell. That I very rarely run into something with that kind of timbre that's that high. So I'm kind of just basing this off of just the sounds that he's creating. So that I actually sounded like it did have natural vibrato. So if you go back and listen to that again, you'll hear the vibrato has this spin sort of sound on it, and the top parts of the waveform sounded more even and more rhythmic. That sounded like a more natural vibrato than what he was doing before. So I started the video over because it just randomly, abruptly ended. I did not expect that to just cut off like that. He's got quite a voice. Man, he's got a range, and he has so much control from the bottom to the top end. I mean, he's clearly a tenor. There's no doubt about that. I'm really impressed by him. A lot of his habits and his health-related things that are issues are just related to the genre, I believe, and it's just a byproduct of singing in the metal style. And I think you're going to run into that a little bit with basically every singer that is in this genre. So anyway, that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed the analysis. Again, thank you, Virtuoso80, for the Patreon subscription. I'm very, very thankful to all of you who watch and all you subscribers and all of you who support me, all of you who give me feedback and criticism and critiques. Thank you so much. I'm inching closer to 1,000 subscribers, and that's like the big one. That's like the number that kind of says like you're in. That's my goal, and I have a surprise kind of lined up for that as well. I'm going to be doing a series on a specific singer. I'm not going to say who it is. I'd like for you guys actually to try and guess who it might be. It might be someone that I've already done, or it might be someone I haven't done yet. So it could go either way. I don't want to spoil it. But I figured I'd make a little competition for those of you who watched all the way through the video. If you can guess who it is, if you're the first person to guess who it is, then I will let you do a free request of any video, any singer you want, within reason. Like, no, like, super crazy, like, grindcore stuff, anything like that. But I'll let you pick an analysis coming up. So, yeah, feel free to guess down in the comments who you think it might be. Like I said, it could be someone that I've done before. It could be someone I haven't done. But it's going to be an entire series of a few videos talking about various elements of something. So, that's coming up at 1,000 subscribers. So, if you haven't subscribed, please do. Please like this video. Thank you for watching. I do have a Patreon. I'm going to place the link. I offer voice lessons if you're interested as well. And just thank you for all your support. And I will see you all next week. Take care. Thanks.